One day in the late 1980s, I was standing in the room behind me. It was then the office of the UCL, Department of Phonetics and Linguistics, and I was talking to my colleague and former teacher, Professor John Wells, when I happened to use the word covert. I don't remember now the sentence or the topic of conversation, but John stopped me with a characteristic smile and pointed out that that was not the traditional way the word was pronounced. I was quite surprised when he told me about the word's origins and its traditional pronunciation. But it's only more recently that I've investigated the fascinating covert history of when and where and why the pronunciation changed. In fact, it's remarkable how much we can uncover with just this one word. The story believed by the public nowadays is that covert is a negated form of overt. So covert is not overt, roughly like apolitical is not political, and declassified is not classified. But as regular viewers of my videos will know, that's not how the word covert came about. If you go way back into the mists of time, there was a link between the two words, but in the history of English, overt comes from the French for open, while covert was formed from the word cover. Just as the past participle burned has a corresponding adjective burnt, so the past participle covered has the corresponding adjective covert, with a closely related meaning, namely concealed, clandestine. And covert was how the word was pronounced for centuries. This, as you can just about make out, is the grave of the 18th century lexicographer John Walker, author of the famous Critical Pronouncing Dictionary of 1791. The only pronunciation Walker gives for our word is covert. It was the only pronunciation given a century later in the first edition of what would become known as the Oxford English Dictionary, and in America, covert was the only pronunciation given in Webster's High School Dictionary of 1868. The adjective had already been in use for centuries when John Walker made his dictionary. We find it in Shakespeare, for example in King Lear's more sinned against than sinning speech.
Caitiff two pieces shake, that under covert and convenient seeming hath practised on man's life.
Therefore let our alliance be combined, and let us presently go sit in council how covert matters may be best disclosed.
The adjective superlative turns up in Richard III, in one of Shakespeare's least pronounceable lines.
Well, he was the covert-sheltered traitor.
Covert had also long been used as a noun with various meanings, all related in some way to the verb cover. Probably the most common one is a hiding place in the undergrowth, usually for animals like foxes. Edgar Allan Poe used the noun in a repeated refrain in his poetic short story, Silence.
I lay close within my covert and observed the actions of the man. And I lay close within my covert and observed the actions of the man.
And here's Emily Dickinson.
By and by, the boldest stole out of his covert to see if time was there.
As we continue into the 20th century, the pronunciation in dictionaries on both sides of the Atlantic continues to be covert for both noun and adjective. So it's the only pronunciation in Daniel Jones's English Pronouncing Dictionary of 1917 and in all of Jones's subsequent editions. It's the only pronunciation given in the 1940s by Kenyon and Knott in their Pronouncing Dictionary of American English, and also in the NBC Handbook of Pronunciation. It's still the only pronunciation in Webster's 1960 New World Dictionary, and we can hear it being used in 1960 by the then US President Dwight Eisenhower, whose statue here at the moment is, appropriately enough, covered.
In the campaign of our opponents, the quick changes from fantastic charge to covert retreat,
In that speech, Eisenhower was campaigning to get his Vice President, Richard Nixon, elected as his successor. But of course, Nixon was defeated in his first bid for the presidency by John F. Kennedy. And we certainly know how JFK pronounced the word. In 1961, he gave quite a famous speech, The President in the Press, delivered to the American Newspaper Publishers Association.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. This nation's foes have openly boasted of acquiring through our newspapers information they would otherwise hire agents to acquire through theft, bribery, or espionage. Details of this nation's covert preparations to counter the enemy's covert operations have been available
So 3 occurrences of the word there, all of them covert. Now from this point forward, we're actually able to hear how this word was used inside the White House among presidents and their staff, thanks to covert presidential recordings. According to the Kennedy Presidential Library, JFK had taping systems installed in 1962. He made 260 hours of recordings. His successor Lyndon Johnson would record approximately 800 hours, and the famous Nixon tapes, made by Johnson's successor, amount to nearly 4,000 hours. That's a lot of recording. But before we actually hear some of those covert presidential recordings, I want to thank today's sponsor, Raycon, for helping to make the video possible, and for my discreet listening equipment, these brilliant earbuds. Before I had my Raycons, I was using some earbuds from a world-famous brand that were literally 3 to 4 times the price. And I kid you not, these Raycons have better sound, they're way more comfortable, and there's none of those annoying pairing issues either. They look better too. Raycons come in a range of colours, so naturally, for maximum covertness, I chose carbon black earbuds and a protective case in concrete. The sound is impressively clear and detailed, and you can choose between 3 sound profiles that tweak the frequency spectrum so you can adapt to different recordings. This is my go-to piece for audio testing, and the Raycons passed with flying blackened concrete. They call them everyday earbuds for a reason. As someone who listens for a living, I can vouch for the comfort. I've had a kind of near relationship with earbuds. They fall out, or they start hurting, or they make my ears itch inside. But with the Raycons, I didn't even have to try the other size tips they supply. And I've been using them right through the making of this video. They have 32 hours battery life, the awareness mode is useful in the city, and IP66 weatherproofing means I can actually use them in the British climate. I definitely recommend them, and if you go to buyraycon.com/Jeff, you'll get 15% off the best-selling everyday earbuds. Brought to you by Raycon. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, President Kennedy recorded a number of meetings. This is the president himself speaking.
Now, it seems to me we ought to be preparing now in the most covert way to do 1 and 2.
Kennedy there, as we might expect, used his traditional pronunciation of the word covert. But in that very same meeting, we also hear the word from Kennedy's Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, Marshall Carter.
There isn't any question in your mind, however open that it is in intermediate range.
There's no question in our minds, sir, and they are genuine. They are not a camouflage or covert attempt to fool us.
So here at last is an example of the new pronunciation. A pronunciation, remember, that was not the one in American dictionaries at the time. Here's the Scholastic Dictionary of American English, first published the same year. And this is John Osland of the State Department.
I shall begin by reviewing in general the 4 phases. We'll then examine each of the phases in more detail. This examination will describe the political, military, economic, and covert actions which might occur in each phase.
U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk.
We then would move more openly and vigorously into the guerrilla field and create maximum confusion on the island, without being too squeamish at this point about the covert character of what is being done.
John A. McCone, the head of the CIA.
The circumstances in Cuba were quite different. The equipment was shipped covertly and without prior notice.
And here is an exchange between McCone and the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara.
Is it your intention to keep the necessary covert contacts?
The second sentence covers that, John. Our policy should be to seek urgently to identify and build contacts. Should say covertly, if you wish.
I don't think that law is true of our law to do this at all. I think it'll be done covertly and it'll be done quite outside of that circle.
Well, I think the ambassador feels very strongly, John, and I'm inclined to agree with him that he should be aware of any covert contacts.
In fact, covert or covert is the only pronunciation I can find among Kennedy's staff and in all subsequent presidential tapes. So what happened to change our word? Well, as we can see from this Google Ngram, the use of both the noun covert and the adjective covert declined during the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. But although the noun continued its decline, the adjective experienced a reversal of fortune. If we zoom in on the period of the adjective's resurgence, we can see what kind of activity triggered it. Remember Eisenhower's speech, fantastic charge and covert retreat? That's a rather poetic kind of language you'd be unlikely to hear from any subsequent president. Kennedy's use of the word the following year was very different. Suddenly, a word that had been declining in use appeared not once but 3 times in a single speech. And though Kennedy's pronunciation was the same as Eisenhower's, all 3 occurrences referred to the new kind of war that the world was engaged in. A Cold War whose agents were secret. America was late in creating a permanent intelligence agency. Britain's MI6 is about half a century older. The European powers had long been vying with each other and spying on each other, while the US was relatively isolated and secure. Americans enjoyed stories of domestic gangsters and FBI agents, while British fiction had been producing international secret agents since at least Rudyard Kipling. Even JFK's list of 10 favourite books featured a certain British agent. But for America, the intelligence failure of Pearl Harbor changed everything. And after World War II, the US found itself one of 2 global powers, vying with each other and spying on each other. To me, it seems clear that the change in our word's pronunciation coincided quite precisely with its new frequency of use, chiefly in the context of America's clandestine activities in the Cold War. What had been a fairly marginal word was suddenly in daily use by people in the US government and its agencies, and in turn by the media and the public. Look at the words which earlier writers most commonly described as covert. In first place, we have glance. That was the example given in the 1962 Scholastic Dictionary of American English. Then we have covert sneer, covert threat, and covert smile. And now look at the most common following words in the decades since then. Covert operation, covert action, covert activity, agent, war, mission, military, aid, op. So there was an increased need to refer to activities that were not in the open. But why choose this word and not, say, secret or clandestine? Well, interestingly, clandestine seems to have had a decline and revival like that of covert, albeit on a smaller scale. But clandestine is a rather cumbersome word. And secret? Of course, we do have secret service, secret agent, secret police, but I think there's a tendency for secret to describe things like institutions, places, and objects like weapons and documents, whereas covert or covert had a tendency to describe actions, whether that's a glance or a military operation. If you do something secretly, people may not know it happened at all, but if you covertly blow up a bridge, the thing that's secret is who did it. Whatever the reason for seizing on this particular word, why change its pronunciation? Well, when a word with a previously quite restricted use suddenly enters the daily awareness of a larger number of people who haven't grown up using it or hearing it very often, its pronunciation may well change, sometimes quite suddenly. Today it may seem obvious that covert would be remodelled to match overt, making a pair of opposites. After all, this opposition was a key feature of the Cold War, in which the competing powers were using 2 kinds of action, the publicly visible and the concealed. But that wouldn't automatically lead to the pairing of covert with overt. In fact, over the centuries, covert was often contrasted with its opposite, but the word it was traditionally contrasted with was open. Here's Alexander Pope's essay on man in 1733.
Together let us beat this ample field, try what the open, what the covert yield.
And William Cooper's translation of the Iliad was published the same year as John Walker's dictionary, 1791. What Grecian here will serve thee, all for thee, wage covert war or open? Even in 1965, despite using the new pronunciation, Martin Luther King contrasted covert not with overt, but with open.
And so in a sense, segregation is still with us. Not in the open sense that it used to be with us, with legal sanction, but in the covert.
So the association of covert with overt may just as well have happened because its pronunciation changed, rather than the other way round. Another factor, one that's often associated with the use of a word by a broader section of the population, is spelling pronunciation. I discuss this a lot in my book, English After RP. With the social changes of the 1960s, British standard pronunciation came to reflect the use of a much less exclusive group of people than before, and this larger population might base their pronunciations of words they hadn't heard that often on how they saw them written. During the Empire, posh RP speakers who'd been posted to the colonies complained of hurricanes and mosquitoes with schwa, but these were now read as hurricanes and mosquitoes. And a traditional pronunciation that had grown far away from the spelling, like forehead, now got pulled back again. Also, as I discussed in my recent video on the word multiple, there's an appeal, at least for some kinds of people, in words that sound relatively technical. Around the time that our word changed, the technical side of secret operations was suddenly very topical and even glamorous. Covert certainly sounds more technical than the old-fashioned and somewhat poetic covert, which even had associations with the countryside. On the other hand, co is a prefix on many words like co-opt, coordinate, coercion, and vert is a stem in many words like divert, avert, subvert. You could say that covert sounds like the offspring of coercion and subvert. Whatever the causes, once the world's foremost user of the old pronunciation had been assassinated, of course I'm not suggesting that that was the covert reason, the new pronunciation rapidly became dominant in the US.
There have been some covert operations in that area that we've been carrying on, blowing up some bridges and things of that kind, roads and so forth. They've got to be done. You just find out how to do it. You have to covertly do it. Well, we got to do it. You don't know anything else?
No, and I'd appreciate it if you'd keep confidential my staying with Jackie tonight.
Oh, I don't know.
I don't want to find out. I don't want to get it in society.
Not a human.
And Johnson's successor, Richard Nixon, became almost synonymous with the word.
Mitchell started doing covert stuff before anyone else. The list is longer than anyone can imagine. It involves the entire U.S. intelligence community. It's incredible. Cover-up had little to do with Watergate. It was mainly to protect the covert operations. Your lives are in danger.
Subpoena them. Christ, get them.
So I would think that we should advise the Times. We will start our covert check, and after McGovern Hatfield, just open it up.
Right. Go ahead.
Does that agree with you?
Yep.
All right, sir. Will do.
Yeah.
As so often, however, dictionaries lagged behind the times. I could certainly have included covert in my video on that topic. The new pronunciation of the adjective doesn't seem to have appeared in American dictionaries until the mid-60s as a second option. Covert was still being listed as the first pronunciation long after it had faded. Eventually, covert pulled into first place, but I think many of you will probably find it rather bizarre that covert is still there as an option for the adjective in the Merriam-Webster online dictionary today. All of this has been very America-centric. We've seen that covert rapidly changed its pronunciation there during the early stages of the Cold War. But what happened elsewhere?
Blimey, the Batmobile! Did you hear that, Penelope? Robin is on the ground someplace. We must act covertly to trap him.
Well, why don't we have Lady Prudence act covertly?
I don't know whether Rudy Valley, the American performer with the terrible English accent there, had to be coached to say covert, but the old pronunciation certainly persisted longer here. As so often, Britain followed the US with a lag of several years, with the adjective reviving in use and its pronunciation duly changing. By the way, for most Brits and Southern Hemisphere speakers, the pronunciation change affected both vowels. The older pronunciation had a weak second syllable, covert or covert, whereas the modern pronunciation has the long nurse vowel, covert, or for most Scots, the dress vowel, covert. I also haven't mentioned the word stress, which in the old pronunciation was fixed on the first syllable for all speakers, but has always been more variable in the newer pronunciation, as it is with overt or overt. If any of you want a video on what people call stress shift, let me know in the comments. But despite having watched Batman as a kid, I wasn't even aware of the Covert pronunciation when John Wells told me about it in there during the late 1980s. My main exposure to the word had been through TV coverage of the Vietnam War, and above all, the Watergate scandal. And I suspect that if I'd heard someone say covert, I probably wouldn't even have recognised that that's the word they were saying. Now, the word would have been on John Wells's mind when he commented on my pronunciation, because around just then he was conducting the first of the preference polls for his Longman pronunciation dictionary. The polls tell us that in 1988, over half of John's British respondents still preferred the old pronunciation, which I find amazing. The polls were open to the public, and I suspect these numbers tell you something about the kind of people who wanted to make sure that their pronunciation was recorded in a dictionary. And as you see, 7% of American respondents in 1993 supposedly still preferred covert. I'm going to make a guess that for most of my viewers, when I mentioned that the adjective has the older pronunciation covert, it came as a complete surprise. That old pronunciation isn't quite dead. Researching this video, I did come across this one clip.
But cameras are only a small part of it. There's also the question of putting in covert staff.
But frankly, I think it's ludicrous of Wiktionary and the online Oxford Learners Dictionary to tell people in this day and age that covert is still the preferred pronunciation in Britain. I mean, it's not as if the dominance of the new pronunciation is a secret.
Oh my god, he actually does.
So that's sick.
Wait, can we get in the video? Make us the thumbnail.